Cartoon Network series have always had a pretty special place in my heart. Growing up in Australia during the late 90s and early 2000s, we had pretty limited options when it came to animation. Other than Saturday mornings and a small handful before school, cartoons were pretty few and far between. It's not that we didn't have great shows to watch, but there just weren't all that many. But luckily one of my mates growing up had the Australian equivalent to cable television, giving me access to Cartoon Network for the first time. And with that came what felt like a never-ending stream of animated series, which led to me discovering all sorts of shows like Codename Kid Next Door, The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, Chowder, and all sorts. Though saying this, by around 2009, standard Australian television did get a few more channels. And with that came a lot more access to certain Cartoon Network shows like Adventure Time or Regular Show. That's probably enough about the absurdly few Australian channels I grew up with. With my introduction of Cartoon Network came so many amazing standout series to watch, and each of them really deserve a video on their own. But for now, let's focus on one of the more fun elements of cartoons, and really most fiction generally, in the villains. For the sake of keeping things neat and tidy, I'll be covering 5 examples that each feel different enough from one another, so they're not standing on each other's toes so much, while at the same time all managing to go about being effective villains in their own right. And to avoid any personal biases beyond just picking the villains I like, I'll be limiting it to one villain per series, with the only other caveat that for this list they all had to air on Cartoon Network. And if you feel like any villains deserve a place on this list, I'd be more than happy to make a follow-up video discussing more villains in the future. Starting off with a personal favourite of mine, and one I'm certain my audience isn't all too shocked made it to this list, we've got Vilgax, who, as I've discussed at relative length in previous videos, underwent a few changes over the years, but seeing as we're talking about peak Cartoon Network villains, let's cover what I and most everyone else considers his peak with his classic series iteration. This is when I feel he's the most effective villain in a way that falls somewhere nicer between 2 of the other villains on this list in terms of scale. It goes without saying that Vilgax is one of the best villains in Ben 10, if not cartoon villains generally. Try not to cover too much ground we've covered in previous videos, he feels like an unrelenting force of nature. From Ben's perspective, especially in the classic series, Vilgax represents this overwhelming monster who also wants the Omnitrix. Only seeing Ben as a bump in the road as far as getting the Omnitrix for himself, he's seemingly got a very reasonable understanding of how the device works, far beyond anyone except maybe its creator Azimuth. Feeling so intelligent while at the same time being this absolute mass monster who's hardly fazed by any of these ultra-powerful alien transformations Ben's been using up to this point. And all the while, Grandpa Max spiralling out of fear after coming face to face with Vilgax previously, even if he's bested him in the past. That defeat doesn't lessen his presence for Max and just sets Vilgax up as even more threatening. As far as motivations go, his obsession with the Omnitrix is the major factor driving his involvement in the series, but what I like about his intentions for the device is that he's not after it for the sake of it, it's more a stepping stone or way for him to achieve his goals as a conqueror, wanting to use the device in order to create an army of Omnitrix wielders to have at his control. Is my one and only real criticism of the classic series Vilgax. We don't get much motivation as to why he's a conqueror. We know from later series why the Omnitrix became such a focal point for him, but we don't really get much on why he wanted to rule the universe other than for the sake of it. He manages to feel so grounded in the lore of the show, he's so tied to the universe at large. What he does even better is manage to simultaneously feel like the biggest and strongest character out there, while not falling into the trap of feeling like a bulky meathead style character. He feels, if not super intelligent, at least very well researched. More than anything, he has this feeling of grandeur. He's larger than life, while Ben feels, particularly at this point in the series, a somewhat regular kid with a huge weight in his shoulders, facing these cosmic level threats, and Vilgax being the biggest, baddest one. Before we move on, if you're a fan of what I do here, please subscribe. Otherwise, if you're a fan of my regular content, mostly covering Ben 10, stick around, I think you'll probably enjoy the rest of this. Sticking with another Man of Action series for our next entry, we've got Kleiss from Generator Rex, who very well may be my favourite Cartoon Network villain, but I haven't fully made up my mind just yet. He manages to capture that same relentless feeling that Vilgax has, but goes about it in a very different way. Kleiss feels like less of a brawler and more of a long-term planner. He shares that same obsessive component that Vilgax has, but the way he goes about it is vastly different, wanting that power as a way to reshape the world, despite already having pretty overwhelming abilities himself, especially when he's in his home Abyssus, where he can make better use of his abilities to manipulate the environment. He's not quite as much of a physical threat to Rex as Vilgax is to Ben. Kleiss isn't a brute force villain, he's more of a manipulator, always seeming like he's working on things behind the scenes. That being said, much like Vilgax, Kleiss is deeply, if not more so, tied to the events that the series revolve around. And if you're unfamiliar with the series, Nanites and Generator Rex can manipulate matter, energy, space, and time. And for most of the series, and most commonly, they're shown to cause mutations, turning people into Evos as the series stand-in for mutants. These Evos range from having slight physical changes to being these massive skyscraper-sized monsters. Though Rex and Kleiss manage to both be exceptions to this rule, staying visually human despite being Evos themselves. Though while being human on the outside, this is nicely contrasted when Van Kleiss rebuilds himself after his first run with Rex. Speaking of mutants, Van Kleiss functions as the Magneto stand-in for the series. He wants to create a safe haven for Evos in a way that's pretty similar to Magneto's vision for mutants in Krakoa or Genosha. However, unlike Magneto, Van Kleiss is much more outwardly just an evil character. He's not really creating a sanctuary, he's more so trying to get access to the Control Nanite in order to reshape the universe, making himself into a functional god. Other than everything I've listed so far, one of the things I love most about Van Kleiss is the contrast between him and Rex. While Rex uses his nanites to create mechanical constructions, Van Kleiss is able to manipulate the nanites around him, using them to control nature and other evos, which gives us as an audience this nice little thematic contrast between nature and technology. And another fun contrast is how they interact with those nanites, Rex absorbing them but needing to offload them to maintain control, while Van Kleiss is more like a nanite vampire, constantly needing to replenish himself, getting stronger the more he has access to. That, and later on, while Rex is able to cure Evos, Van Kleiss is able to force the transformation of people into Evos. And all that aside, I just love Van Kleiss' design. His metal arm is fantastic, it has this real weight to it. With those sharp little needles and the way the arm coils and extends around, it only adds to every scene it's used in. That, and he has this infectious personality, largely thanks in no small part to Troy Baker, who, linking back to Ben 10 for a moment, voices Asmuth's father in Ben 10 Destroy All Aliens. Actually, before we move on, I almost forgot to mention, there's an episode of the series that revolves entirely around Van Kleiss, and it's a series highlight for me. Even if you're not familiar with the show, I'd seriously recommend the episode A Brief History of Time, with the caveat that it's better to go in with an understanding of the show beforehand. Next up, we have the standout villain in Slade from Teen Titans. Right from the start of the series, he's this major threat lurking in the shadows, sort of manipulating everything from behind the scenes in a very similar way to Vilgax before the Season 1 finale. What I like about Slade and what sets him apart from the others on this list, particularly to this point in his relationship to Robin, over the course of the series, Slade sort of becomes this obsession for Robin, psychologically torturing him to a point where he seems insane to his teammates, eventuating this great episode where Robin finds himself in this real struggle with being a good team member or having this massive fixation on getting Slade. If that's not enough, we've got the whole terror plot, which certainly got me tearing up a bit my first and or second viewing. Having a character who goes on to cause so much heartbreak for the team generally, especially Beast Boy, and as enormous as that betrayal feels, to Slade, she's just another tool he used as a way to get to the Teen Titans with. I'm starting to see a pattern in the way these villains change the protagonists of the series that they go up against. Vilgax, for me, acts as a bit of a measuring stick as to how far along in these heroes' journey Ben is, going from being this unstoppable force to a somewhat stoppable one, and eventually being entirely dwarfed by an end of the series Ben. Van Kleiss, while not exactly the same, nicely reflects Rex's journey as Rex begins to piece things together, maintaining that same threat level but in new and interesting ways as we learn more about the goings-on of the series. Whereas Slade acts as a way to force character development onto the Teen Titans, and particularly Robin, constantly challenging them both in their capabilities as heroes, but more so in their relationships to one another. These last two feel so directly in contrast to one another, but manage to also feel like they belong together in a category of their own as these sort of inevitable forces of nature. Start off with a villain who is outrightly and unapologetically just an evil character. With this one, I'm starting to see a pattern of Cartoon Network villains not being directly center of stage right from the get-go. Like Slade and Vilgax, we don't get our first appearance or face-to-face encounter with the Lich right away. The Lich's first appearance has him trapped in the Candy Kingdom before being released after influencing a snail. Which, saying out loud, I'm realising just how fun of a contrast the Lich is within Adventure Time, and how he's from a far sillier series than Teen Titans, Generator X, or Ben 10, while at the same time being the most overtly evil, most horrific of these villains. Like the other villains on this list, after an initial defeat, they work their way back into the series. In this instance, the Lich possesses Princess Bubblegum, turning her into this super grotesque monster, which again, despite the light-hearted tone Adventure Time has, carries such a weight to it. Otherwise, we see an alternate reality after Finn wishes for the Lich to be erased from existence, creating a new timeline only leading to Finn releasing the Lich's spirit through a mutagen bomb, reforming him. Throughout Adventure Time, the Lich feels like an ever-looming shadow, constantly feeling like you're moments away from having him corrupt someone else. And the death of all life certainly feels like the most outright evil on this list so far. Unlike the other villains on this list, the Lich doesn't crave power, he craves nothingness. And unlike the other villains on this list, and an element I would have loved to see each of them explore in their own respective series, the Lich gets what he wants. He successfully exterminates all life in the universe. And subsequently, he's rewarded with nothing but a sense of emptiness that came along with achieving his goals. He's finished his arc and he's won. There is no reward, there's no next thing, he's fulfilled his purpose. And even after he's won, he still loses. The Lich simultaneously is the simplest villain on this list, while managing to be the only villain that gets a conclusion. Moving on to our last villain, and one that shares the most similarities with the Lich, despite a very different character, is Bill Cipher. He's quite literally a two-dimensional character who's desperately trying to free himself from his dimension where his powers are limited. Bill inhabits this chaotic, lawless dimension called the Nightmare Realm with a few of his mates, and from there they try and travel to our dimension to create a similar level of randomized chaos. As far as this list goes, he falls somewhere between Slade and the Lich. He's definitely a manipulative character, being the most inherently so on this list. He's constantly making deals with whatever character he can get in contact with throughout the series. His main goal in the show is to create a physical form for himself in our world so that he can spread chaos. I wouldn't normally be a fan of chaos for chaos's sake, but in combination with his personality, this just sort of works. For Bill, there's a sort of whimsy in all the horrific actions he takes, particularly in the series finale in Weirdmageddon, where he gains a physical form, allowing him to mess around with our reality. Circling back to that sort of two-dimensionality of his character I touched on earlier, while fun and effective, constantly weaving in and out of the story, being tied to past events and characters' backstories, he himself isn't all too fleshed out. Like the Lich, he feels like a sort of force of nature, but in that, he reacts to things so brashly. He's upset or frustrated when things don't go his way. He seems like he just wants to have his own idea of fun, and when that's taken away from him, he gets actually upset in a way that other villains wouldn't be, or at least other villains on this list haven't really shown to be, or at least not as openly as Bill is. They don't lash out in the same way. Each of these villains bring their own bits and pieces to the table, whether it's the fact that Vilgax feels like an absolute force of nature in the classic series, the way Kleiss roots himself to the history of the series, or the way Slade is constantly mentally challenging the main cast. Bill's general manipulation or the Lich's never-ending pursuit of extinction, they all stand out from one another while sharing these great core elements that make them effective villains. Despite most of these characters being particularly powerful, their power isn't what makes them great, it's the way they change the series and more than that, the protagonists. As far as I'm concerned, Cartoon Network has some of the best villains in animation. Though if you disagree with me or think any other cartoon villains deserve a spot on this list, let me know. Otherwise, if you've made it to this point in the video, thank you, I really appreciate that. I know this is slightly different than my usual content, but I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.